Hello, everyone. I'd like you to look at your hands and make them into fists. Yep, I mean it. Clench your fingers a bit tighter. Tighter still. How's your arm feeling now? And your upper body? How would it feel like to keep your fists clenched like this forever? Now, slowly uncurl your fingers and let your palm stretch until it's fully open. And notice how that feels. And I'd like you to keep these feelings in mind, of the clenched fist and the outstretched hand, and for the next few minutes, try to reimagine security. Security wasn't something I always thought a great deal about. I was lucky enough that it wasn't until I was 16 that I realized how important it can be. Then I went on an international youth camp in France. You might be able to imagine it. Big tent, lots of young people from all over Europe. I had a great time, a really great time. And I became good friends with a group of teenagers from Croatia, then part of Yugoslavia. But it was 1991, and shortly after we all went home, the war there intensified. My friend Nina and I wrote to each other for a while. We wrote letters, in fact, because there wasn't any email then. But then the fighting forced her and her family to flee their town. And after that, the only news that I heard from where she lived came on TV bulletins. Some of you might also have seen them, where there were journalists in flak jackets standing in front of burnt-out houses. This experience really woke me up. I was horrified that I could resume my comfortable life while my friends were exposed to such experiences. And it convinced me that there must be other ways of dealing with conflict that don't require teenage girls, or anyone else for that matter, to experience the kind of insecurity my friend Nina had to face. And so I got involved in the field of peace building. And for the last 2 decades, I've worked with people who live on the front lines of violent conflict around the world. And what I've learned from them, time and time again, is that even in the bloodiest conflicts and the darkest moments, peace and security are built in the end by talking, by dialogue and negotiation about the root causes of conflict. In this sense, peace and security are possible when all parties approach the problems with an outstretched hand and not that clenched fist. But why does this matter to those of us who don't live in places where there's violent conflict? Well, I think it matters because what we think about security, how we believe we build security, has a huge impact on the kind of world we live in. So let's start with a basic question. What does security actually mean? Is it the same as defense? I recently did a Flickr search for images of the term security, and this is what I found. Does this make you feel safe? Is this what our security depends on? Actually, wherever we live in the world, the most likely causes of insecurity are these: financial vulnerability and the widening gap between rich and poor, concentration of power among a small elite and the marginalization of large numbers of people, climate change and competition for resources, patriarchy, systems of male dominance that exclude or oppress women, and the use of militarized violence by states and by armed groups such as ISIS. Now, all of these factors affect us differently, but they also have something in common. Have you noticed how they all cross boundaries? As our world gets increasingly interconnected, our security and our insecurity are getting intertwined. These are not problems that can be solved by states working on their own or states working against each other or sorted out with automatic weapons and razor wire. These problems require collective global solutions. And that's why the 21st century requires us to build security with an outstretched hand. But sadly, we're still trapped in old ways of thinking. Did you know, for example, that every year the world is spending £1,000 billion on the military, all in the name of defense? It's clocking up as you sit here. Wouldn't you think, though, with spending on this scale, we should be feeling safe by now? But actually, we're being told the opposite, that the threats are increasing. And this suggests to me that there's something going very wrong with our current approach. But I'm not the only one saying it. A leading British military think tank recently described the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya as strategic failures. Strategic failures, not slight mistakes, but planned actions that have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and left huge instability behind. And the British intelligence services have said that the Iraq war contributed to the radicalisation of many young Muslims. And research on counter-terrorism policy here in the UK is showing that it's often increasing tension and division within our society. And yet there's no attempt to change course. Instead, we're getting more of the same, but without so many boots on the ground. And so in response to the threat from ISIS, governments are deploying airstrikes and armed drones and special forces. But what we know is that violence like this is exacerbating insecurity. Take drone strikes. These are supposedly precision weapons. Yesterday, Obama was apologizing for having killed 2 Western hostages by mistake, but that is the tip of the iceberg. Did you know that in targeting one senior al-Qaeda official, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is in fact reportedly still alive, the CIA has so far killed over 100 people in Pakistan, including 76 children. Actions like those fuel huge anger and resentment. They make it much easier for rebel groups to recruit. The clenched fist approach is making us more insecure. But yet there's almost no debate about alternatives. That's partly because the term national security is often used to close down debate and discussion and scrutiny. We're told there aren't any other options. But that is not true. There are other options. It's just that they begin from a different starting point. Real security is built by addressing the underlying causes of conflict. It requires us to deal with inequalities of power and wealth and consumption. It's based on human rights and on principles of interdependence, cooperation, and mutual respect. It's not dictated by our worst fears. It relies on our common humanity. And in this sense, it's built with an outstretched hand. This approach is sometimes called the human security approach because it puts people at the heart of policymaking. The human security framework has 7 elements, all of which are supposed to be in place to build basic security for everyone. And these are access to income, usually from work, access to nutritious, sustainably produced food, protection of health and treatment of disease, care for our natural world and protection from disaster, freedom from violence, trust within and between communities, and political participation, rights, and freedoms. Now, all these 7 elements need to be in place, built together to build basic security for all of us. And it's a responsibility not only for states and governments, but for individuals and communities. And it starts with a very simple question. What does security mean to you? What do you need to feel secure? Now, in case you think this is all just really nice theory that doesn't have a place in the real world, I'd like to tell you some stories about how it can make a difference in practice. The Philippines has suffered from decades of armed conflict. Back in 1992, President Ramos decided to take a different approach to the country's problems, and he started peace talks with the armed groups. But community leaders urged him not to limit the conversation to those with the guns, usually the men, but to initiate a process to unite people around a common vision of a just and peaceful society. And so a commission was created which toured the country and reached out to people from all walks of life and asked what they thought about the causes of conflict where they lived and what could be done. And as a result, it identified 6 pathways to peace, key structural reforms that enjoyed widespread public support. But in places where there's been ongoing violent conflict, government commissions are not always trusted. That was the case in northern Mali, where government commissions had in fact come and gone without making any real impression on long-standing, persistent insecurity. And so there, a group of community leaders came up with their own response. They decided to organise inter-community meetings on a huge scale across the north of the country. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of people took part in each meeting, and they found solutions to local disputes over land and water. As a result, markets reopened, some combatants turned in their weapons. The process met people's basic security needs. But maybe this all feels just rather far away. So how about somewhere closer to home? Well, before the IRA ceasefire in 1994, a group of people in Northern Ireland decided to set up what they called a citizens' inquiry into options for the future. They wanted to know what ordinary people thought about the causes of conflict and what could be done. And so they too set up a commission which travelled around Northern Ireland, and it organised public meetings and discussion forums and focus groups, and you could write your submissions if you wanted to. And their report identified ideas that became key concepts in the negotiation process. But actually, crucially, what people say is the big difference it made was encouraging people to talk to each other in their communities about options for the future. Now, I'm not suggesting that the human security approach is some sort of magic solution, but I do think all those stories show the powerful impact of enabling public conversations about the causes of insecurity. And they've started with an outstretched hand, a willingness to listen to each other's needs and fears and seek common solutions together. Some governments have applied this approach to the way they do international relations. Canada, for example, has at times put human security at the heart of its foreign policy. So what's to stop us from applying an approach like that to the way we do security here in the UK, or how we think internationally for the wider world? Well, some might say that that's too risky a strategy at the moment. What use is an outstretched hand if someone's trying to punch you in the face? But after 13 years of the war on terror, I think we can confidently say that punching back isn't working. Responding to violence with yet more violence is making us all more insecure. We need the courage to try something different. So instead of asking the question, how can we build our security over here by defeating our enemies over there, we need to be asking a different question. How can we contribute to building basic security for everyone? Now, if we ask that question, we need to think differently about two things: power and vulnerability. Let's talk first about power. The growing violence that we see in the world right now isn't an accident. It's the result of deliberate choices that are reinforcing inequality and marginalisation. Our political and economic elites are working very hard to secure their own privileges, but they're not thinking about the population at large. And their decisions are backed up by an arms trade and a global security industry that are making vast amounts of money by feeding the narrative of fear and threat and selling weaponized solutions to anyone who's willing to pay. These power dynamics will need to change for us to do security differently. But we also need to change how we think about vulnerability. We've been conditioned to think that an outstretched hand is more vulnerable than a clenched fist. And if we just clench our fists a bit tighter or make them a bit bigger, perhaps forever, we can see off any kind of threat. But common sense tells us that no model guarantees total security, and the evidence tells us that the current model is making things worse. In my experience of the biggest breakthroughs in ending violent conflict around the world, they've come when the parties have taken the risk of reaching out and responding to the vulnerability of the other side, and when they've accepted for themselves that the other side will need to have a role in providing their security. I remember being at a workshop once in Colombia where we were discussing all kinds of obstacles to ending the conflict there, and lots of really interesting suggestions were made. But the one point that stayed with me from that conversation was made by a Jesuit priest, Padre Alejandro, and he'd spent a long time on the front lines of the conflict. And he had the courage to say simply, the main problem is that we haven't loved each other enough. The most transformative moments in peace processes around the world have come when the parties have responded to each other's humanity, when they've taken the risk, perhaps after a long time, of rebuilding a relationship across the divide. They've slowly unclenched their fists, and they've tentatively offered an outstretched hand. A few years after meeting my friend Nina, I went to live in Croatia and Bosnia, and there I met all kinds of people who were working to rebuild relationships, to build security from the bottom up. That is a photo I wanted to show you of a workshop organised by Friends at the Centre for Nonviolent Action. And they've been bringing together war veterans from all the different communities to sit together and listen to each other's experiences. Efforts like this all around the world are vital, but our political leaders desperately need to learn from their example. Here in the UK, that would mean investing far more in addressing the underlying causes of conflict. Far less of those billions we saw earlier in the military, far more in peace building and diplomacy. But a transition to a new model of security probably needs to start with a conversation. So next time you hear politicians talking about security, ask yourself whether their approach represents an outstretched hand or a clenched fist. Does it make you feel more secure, or does it feed your fear? And if you were part of a conversation about security, what would you say? What are your basic security needs? What do you know about the security needs of people elsewhere in the world? I would urge you to have those conversations with people around you. And I would also urge you to remember that we have choices about how we respond to today's security challenges. Are we doomed to endless war? Or can we harness our creativity, our intellect, and our humanity and build a new kind of security for our world? In the end, our future is likely to depend on the kind of security we choose to believe in. Thank you.